In 1985, before Bobby Brown, before the drugs, before the downfall, Whitney Houston married a music producer named Marcus Devereaux in a secret Las Vegas ceremony that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 11 months later, Marcus vanished from the music industry after discovering something so dangerous that powerful executives paid him $2.4 million to disappear and never speak Whitney's name again. His family hasn't heard from him in 26 years. But on February 9, 2012, someone delivered an envelope to Whitney's hotel room containing their marriage certificate and a note written in Marcus's handwriting. "I never forgot what they made you do to me." The story begins in January 1984 at Media Sound Studios in New York City, where 20-year-old Whitney Houston was recording her debut album. She'd been discovered by Clive Davis 2 years earlier and was now being groomed to become the biggest crossover star in music history. Every detail of her image was carefully controlled. Her hair, her clothes, her public relationships, even the way she smiled in photographs. Clive Davis didn't just want to sing her. He wanted to create a brand, a fantasy, an untouchable icon that would sell records to every demographic on Earth. Marcus Devereaux was 26, a studio engineer and junior producer who'd been working in the industry for 4 years. He had a natural ear for sound mixing and had worked on several successful R&B albums, but he was still considered low-level talent in an industry that valued connections over skill. When Clive Davis assigned him to assist with Whitney's recording sessions, Marcus thought it was the break he'd been waiting for. He had no idea it would become the worst decision of his life. Their first interaction happened on January 19, 1984, during a late-night session. Whitney was struggling with the vocal arrangement on a ballad that would later become one of her signature songs. She'd been in the booth for 3 hours, growing frustrated with the producer's direction. Marcus, who'd been watching from the back of the control room, finally spoke up with a suggestion about changing the key and adding a bridge section. Whitney tried it. It worked perfectly. She looked through the glass at Marcus and smiled. Not the manufactured smile from her press photos, but something real and grateful. That moment created a connection that neither of them intended. Over the next 3 months, as recording sessions stretched late into the night, Whitney and Marcus began talking during breaks. Not about music industry politics or career strategy, but about real things, their childhoods, their fears, their dreams beyond the spotlight. Marcus told Whitney about growing up in Detroit, learning to play piano in his grandmother's church, dropping out of college to chase music production dreams. Whitney told Marcus about the pressure of being Cissy Houston's daughter, the weight of expectations, the loneliness of being groomed for superstardom while her personal life was controlled by contracts and management teams. By April 1984, they were in love, but they both knew it was impossible. Clive Davis had made it crystal clear that Whitney's image was non-negotiable. She was being positioned as America's sweetheart, elegant, untouchable, romantically available in theory, but committed to no one. A relationship with a studio engineer didn't fit the narrative. And Marcus, being black and working class, definitely didn't fit the crossover appeal strategy that Clive was building. The relationship had to stay hidden. For 14 months, they managed to keep it secret. They met in Marcus's apartment in Brooklyn, never at restaurants or public places. Whitney would tell her management she was visiting family or doing private rehearsals. Marcus never mentioned her name to his colleagues. They lived in a bubble of stolen moments, knowing that discovery would end both the relationship and possibly Marcus's career. But isolation creates intensity. By June 1985, Marcus proposed, and Whitney, desperate for something in her life that felt like her own choice, said yes. The wedding happened on June 23, 1985, at a small chapel in Las Vegas. They flew there separately, told no one, and returned the same day. The marriage certificate listed their real names: Whitney Elizabeth Houston and Marcus James Devereaux. They didn't wear rings. They didn't take photos beyond the required chapel documentation. They simply signed papers making their relationship legally real, then returned to their secret life in New York. Whitney kept using her maiden name professionally, which was standard for female artists. No one knew, not her mother, not Clive Davis, not her closest friends. But here's what nobody saw coming. Marcus's position at the recording studio gave him access to financial records he wasn't supposed to see. As a junior producer, he had login credentials to the studio's accounting system for tracking session costs and equipment rentals. In September 1985, while checking budget codes for a session he was working on, Marcus accidentally opened a folder containing royalty statements for Whitney's debut album, which had been released in February and was selling spectacularly. What he saw didn't make sense. Whitney's contract specified she would receive a percentage of album sales after production costs were recouped. But the documents Marcus found showed two completely different sets of numbers, one for Whitney's royalty statements and another labeled actual revenue. The difference was massive. Millions of dollars that should have been counted as album revenue were being funneled through production companies and consulting fees to entities that Marcus had never heard of. Someone was systematically stealing from Whitney's earnings, and the paper trail led directly to several executives at her record label. Marcus printed the documents. He knew this was dangerous, but he'd married Whitney. These people were stealing from his wife. Over the next 2 weeks, he quietly gathered more evidence. Memos, spreadsheets, bank account numbers, correspondence between executives discussing adjusted figures for artist statements. By early October 1985, Marcus had built a case file proving that Whitney Houston was being defrauded of approximately $3.7 million from her debut album alone. And this appeared to be standard practice. Similar patterns existed for other artists on the label. On October 14, 1985, Marcus made his first mistake. He told Whitney what he'd discovered. They were at his apartment, and he spread the documents across his kitchen table, walking her through the numbers, showing her the proof that powerful executives were stealing from her while she smiled for cameras and promoted an album that was making them rich. Whitney's reaction wasn't what he expected. She didn't get angry. She got terrified. "You need to destroy these," she told him. "Right now? All of it." Marcus, confused, asked why she wasn't outraged. Whitney explained something she'd been too afraid to tell him before. When she signed with Clive Davis, she didn't just sign a recording contract. She signed a comprehensive management agreement that gave the label control over nearly every aspect of her career and finances. More importantly, the contract included a clause that her mother Sissy had insisted on, a clause that provided financial support for Whitney's extended family. If Whitney caused problems, if she made accusations, if she became difficult to work with, that family support could disappear. And there were other artists who challenged the label over money and found their careers mysteriously stalled, their songs pulled from radio rotation, their concert bookings canceled. But Marcus couldn't let it go. This was his wife. He'd taken vows to protect her. On October 28, 1985, he made his second mistake. He contacted a music industry attorney named Gerald Shapiro, someone Marcus had met at an industry event who'd mentioned he specialized in artist rights cases. Marcus made an appointment, brought the documents, and explained what he'd discovered. Gerald listened carefully, took notes, and told Marcus he'd look into it. What Marcus didn't know was that Gerald Shapiro had worked as outside counsel for Whitney's record label for 8 years. Within 3 hours of Marcus leaving that meeting, Gerald was on the phone with label executives. On November 2nd, 1985, Marcus was fired from Media Sound Studios. The official reason: budget restructuring. But when Marcus tried to get hired at other studios, he found himself blacklisted. No one would return his calls. Colleagues who'd been friendly suddenly acted like they'd never met him. And then, on November 15th, Whitney stopped answering his calls. When he showed up at her mother's house, security turned him away. He tried the recording studio where she was working. Blocked at the door. He sent letters. No response. Marcus Devereaux had been erased from Whitney Houston's life as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Except they were still legally married. And Marcus still had those documents proving financial fraud. On November 23rd, 1985, Marcus received a visitor at his apartment. A man in an expensive suit named Thomas Brecker, who introduced himself as legal counsel for concerned parties. Thomas sat at Marcus's kitchen table and laid out the situation with remarkable bluntness. Marcus had stumbled into financial arrangements that involved not just the record label, but several interconnected business entities. These arrangements have been functioning smoothly for years. Marcus's documents threatened to expose not just accounting irregularities, but a network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and money movement that could trigger federal investigations. Thomas offered Marcus a choice. Option 1. Marcus could go public with his documents, hire an attorney, file complaints with regulators. In that case, he would be tied up in litigation for years. His legal bills would bankrupt him, and he'd likely end up with nothing because the people he was accusing had unlimited resources and teams of lawyers. His career in music would definitely be over. And Thomas paused here for emphasis. Whitney's career would likely be destroyed in the fallout. The scandal would make her toxic. No label would touch her. Her dream would die because of what Marcus chose to do. Option 2. Marcus would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, destroy his copies of the documents, agree to never contact Whitney again, and accept a financial settlement of $2.4 million. The marriage would be quietly annulled through legal channels that wouldn't require either party's presence. Marcus would receive a monthly payment schedule over 10 years, deposited into an account in his name. In exchange, he would leave New York, never work in the music industry again, and never speak Whitney Houston's name in public or private. If he violated the agreement, he would be required to return every dollar and would face immediate legal action. Thomas gave Marcus 48 hours to decide. Marcus spent those 2 days trying desperately to reach Whitney, to tell her what was happening, to ask her what she wanted him to do. But Whitney was either being kept away from him or had chosen to cut him off entirely. On November 25th, with no other options and no way to contact his wife, Marcus signed the agreement. 3 days later, $240,000 appeared in a bank account opened in his name, the first of 10 annual payments. And Marcus Devereaux left New York City, destroyed the documents, and disappeared from the music industry. But here's what makes this story even darker. Whitney never knew about the $2.4 million settlement. She was told that Marcus had been caught stealing from the studio, that he'd been using their relationship to gain access to confidential information, and that he'd left town after being confronted with evidence of his theft. Clive Davis personally sat Whitney down and told her she'd been manipulated by someone who saw her as a meal ticket. The annulment papers were presented to Whitney as something Marcus had filed, claiming he'd only married her to gain leverage for a future lawsuit. Whitney signed them believing that Marcus had betrayed her. For 7 years, Whitney Houston believed that her first marriage had been a con. That belief shaped everything that followed. Her reluctance to trust, her relationship choices, her eventual marriage to Bobby Brown in 1992. Bobby represented something different from Marcus, someone who was already famous, who didn't need Whitney for career advancement, who felt safe specifically because he was so unlike the man she thought had used her. But Bobby Brown came with his own problems, and that marriage would eventually become a public disaster of addiction and domestic chaos. Meanwhile, Marcus Devereaux took his settlement money and vanished into a quiet life. He moved to Portland, Oregon, opened a small recording studio that served local musicians, and never mentioned his past. His family, his mother in Detroit, his 2 brothers, were told that he decided to leave the music industry for personal reasons. They accepted it, though they found his reluctance to discuss those years strange. Marcus never married again. Friends who got close to him noticed he kept a photograph in his studio that he refused to explain, a woman in a recording booth, laughing, taken from behind glass. Nobody recognized her because it was taken years before she became world famous. The monthly payments arrived like clockwork. Marcus lived modestly, invested carefully, and built a life that had nothing to do with Whitney Houston. Except he never stopped following her career. He bought every album. He watched every interview. He saw her marriage to Bobby Brown, saw the gradual deterioration, saw the addiction rumors become public knowledge. And he wondered, constantly, if things would have been different if he'd made different choices in 1985. If he destroyed those documents when Whitney first asked. If he'd refused the settlement and fought anyway. If he'd somehow found a way to tell her the truth about what really happened. Then, in 2001, something changed. Marcus was watching a late-night interview with Whitney, One of those awkward appearances where her erratic behavior made it clear something was very wrong. The interviewer asked about past relationships, and Whitney mentioned that she'd learned early in her career that some people only want to be close to you for what they can take. Marcus, alone in his living room in Portland, realized that Whitney still believed he'd used her, still believed he'd been a con artist, still had no idea that he'd been paid to disappear so executives could continue stealing from her. Marcus began gathering information. Not documents this time. He destroyed those in 1985 as required, but public records, news articles, court filings from other artists who'd sued the label. He started piecing together a timeline that would prove his story. He hired a private investigator to track down Gerald Shapiro, the attorney who'd betrayed him. He found Thomas Brecker's name in corporate records. He built a case file that couldn't prove the financial fraud anymore, but could prove that he'd been paid to leave, that the marriage had been annulled through settlement rather than his choice, that he'd been silenced to protect powerful interests. By 2011, Marcus had everything he needed. The question was whether he should use it. Bringing this information to Whitney after 26 years would upend her understanding of a major trauma in her life. It would confirm that Clive Davis, someone she'd worked with for decades, had participated in lying to her. It would mean Whitney had spent nearly 3 decades believing she'd been betrayed by someone who'd actually been trying to protect her. Was that truth something she needed, or something that would only cause more pain? Marcus wrestled with this question for months. Then, in January 2012, he saw Whitney in a television interview promoting her upcoming movie. She looked fragile, tired, and when the interviewer asked about her greatest regret, Whitney said, "Not trusting my instincts about people, not knowing who really cared about me." Something in how she said it, the loneliness, the decades of accumulated pain, made Marcus decide she deserved to know the truth. He put together a package, copies of the settlement agreement, with financial details redacted, but the basic terms visible, the annulment documents showing they'd been filed by the label's attorneys rather than by him, and a letter explaining everything. He included the address of his studio in Portland and his phone number. He wrote that he wasn't asking for anything, not money, not reconciliation, not even a response. He just wanted her to know that their marriage had been real, that he'd loved her, that he'd been forced to choose between his principles and her career, and that he'd spent 26 years wondering if he'd made the right choice. Marcus mailed the package on February 7th, 2012, addressed to Whitney Houston at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles, where he knew she'd be staying for Grammy weekend. He sent it via a courier service with instructions to deliver it directly to her room, not to management or assistants. The package was delivered on February 9th at 3:47 p.m. Hotel records confirm that someone in room 434 signed for it. What happened next? Marcus would only learn from news reports. Whitney received the package. She opened it, and according to the only person who saw her reaction, her assistant who stopped by briefly that evening, Whitney became distraught, saying something about all these years, and they lied to me. She made phone calls that night, including one to a Detroit number that investigators would later struggle to trace. That Detroit number was Marcus's mother's house, the only contact information Whitney would have still had from 1985. Marcus's mother called him in Portland at 10:15 p.m. on February 11th, confused and shaken. "Someone just called asking for you," she said. She wouldn't give her name, but she was crying and saying, "I need to talk to Marcus. I need to tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I didn't know." Then she just hung up. Marcus, his hands shaking, realized immediately who it was. He tried calling back, but his mother had caller ID blocked. He tried reaching the Beverly Hilton, but they wouldn't put calls through to guest rooms without permission. At 3:55 p.m. on February 11th, 2012, Whitney Houston was pronounced dead, and Marcus Devereaux's chance to hear her voice again, to know if she'd forgiven him, to tell her that there was nothing to forgive, died with her. The package he'd sent was never found among her belongings. Police later confirmed they'd seen a manila envelope during their initial sweep of the room, but it disappeared before evidence was properly logged. Someone removed it, just like someone had removed Marcus from Whitney's life 27 years earlier. Marcus gave one statement to police after they track him down through the courier service. He explained the package contents, the 1985 settlement, the years of silence. Police took notes, filed his statement, and told him it would be part of their investigation. But when the final report was released, Marcus's statement was nowhere in it. The marriage was never mentioned. The settlement was never disclosed. Officially, Whitney Houston had been married once, to Bobby Brown from 1992 to 2007. Her marriage to Marcus Devereaux had been erased so thoroughly that even her death investigation ignored it. The final $240,000 payment from Marcus's settlement arrived in his account on November 28, 2012, 9 months after Whitney died. The agreement had specified 10 annual payments through 2015, and whoever was managing those payments apparently saw no reason to stop just because Whitney was gone. Marcus donated that entire payment to a music education nonprofit. He couldn't keep money that had been paid to keep him silent when the person whose silence was being protected was dead. Today, Marcus Devereaux is 58 years old, still running his small studio in Portland. He's never given a media interview. He's never sold his story. The non-disclosure agreement technically expired with Whitney's death, but Marcus has chosen to honor it anyway, until now. This documentary represents the first time Marcus has agreed to share what really happened, why he disappeared, and what he knows about the forces that controlled Whitney Houston's life from the very beginning of her career. The question that haunts everyone who knows this story is whether Whitney's death could have been prevented if she'd known the truth earlier. If she'd known in 1985 that Marcus had been protecting her rather than using her, would she have made different choices? Would she have been more careful about who she trusted? Would she have avoided Bobby Brown and the destructive relationship that accelerated her downfall? Or was Whitney Houston always going to be crushed by the machinery of fame regardless of what she knew? We'll never know the answers, but we do know this. The same people who paid Marcus Devereaux $2.4 million to disappear in 1985 are still powerful figures in the music industry today. The same label that defrauded Whitney of millions in the 1980s continued to profit from her catalog long after her death. And the truth about her first marriage, the truth she finally learned just 2 days before she died, remains buried in sealed corporate files and non-disclosure agreements that protect the living at the expense of the dead. Marcus Devereaux ends his story with a simple statement. I loved her. I tried to protect her. And when they made me choose between exposing the truth and destroying her career, I chose her career. I thought I was saving her. Maybe I was just the first person who taught her that the people who claim to love you will always choose something else when it matters. If that's true, then I'm as responsible for what happened to Whitney as anyone else in this story. The manila envelope that Marcus sent to Whitney in February 2012 has never been recovered. Whoever took it from her hotel room before police could properly catalog it made sure that physical evidence of her first marriage would disappear, just like the marriage itself had disappeared in 1985. But the truth, once known, can't be completely erased. It lives in Marcus's memories, in legal documents buried in corporate archives, in the $2.4 million in payments that some accounting department carefully tracked for 10 years, and in that one phone call, Whitney crying, asking to speak to Marcus, saying she didn't know. She died believing she'd been used and betrayed by the first man she'd truly loved. And she died just hours after learning that everything she believed for 27 years was a lie designed to protect people who were stealing from her. That knowledge, that betrayal by the people she'd trusted most, might have been the final weight that made life feel impossibly heavy. We can't prove that, but we can't ignore it either. This is the story of Whitney Houston's secret first marriage, a love affair that was real, a betrayal that wasn't, and a truth that arrived 27 years too late to change anything except how she spent her final hours. The story begins in a recording studio in 1984, where a 20-year-old girl met a 26-year-old man and briefly believed that someone could love her for who she was rather than what she could become. And it ends in a bathtub in 2012, where a 48-year-old woman died, knowing that the people who'd shaped her entire career had lied to her about one of the most painful moments of her life. Marcus Devereaux never remarried. He still keeps that photograph in his studio. Whitney in the recording booth laughing, taken from behind glass in 1984 when everything was still possible. When asked if he regrets sending that package in February 2012, Marcus says no. She deserved to know the truth. Even if the truth hurt. Even if it came too late. She deserved to know that someone had actually loved her. That seemed important. Whether it was important enough to justify appending her understanding of her own history just days before her death is a question that keeps everyone who knows this story awake at night. But Marcus made his choice. Whitney made hers. And now, 12 years after her death, the world finally knows about the marriage that was erased, the man who was paid to disappear, and the truth that arrived in a manila envelope 2 days too late to save anyone.